This workshop, we're going to go through how I deploy web applications to the Permaweb. Permaweb is a cloud platform designed to publish and serve web artifacts from a decentralized permanent storage network. Using a permanent storage network, you pay once to post your application and content, and it'll be available forever. The ability to pay once is great for developers and end users because it assures that the application will always be available even if the developers are no longer maintaining the project. Developers can make incremental improvements and enhances, and then the users can choose whether they want to use the new features or not. Creates a powerful kind of open dynamic for application development. So if you're a web developer interested in the Permaweb, hopefully this will give you some ideas on how you might go about deploying your web applications. What you really should know as you go through this workshop is be familiar with web development, especially JavaScript, Node.js, and Git. You should also understand the concepts behind Arweave and the Permaweb, even though we'll get into some of that during the course of the workshop. Finally, you should be comfortable around the command line. We'll do this in three parts. One is building a web app, and we're just going to build a simple counter web app and go through the steps from scratch. I'll be using Svelte and Vite to do this, but you can use any web app technology to build a web app. The second is deploying to the Permaweb. So once we have our little web app up and running, we're going to publish it to the Permaweb using a CLI tool. And then finally, we're going to set up a reverse proxy to the published app on the Permaweb so we can reference it with a fully qualified domain name and have SSL and all of that set up correctly. So with that, hopefully this workshop will take about 30 minutes, maybe even less. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started. And the first thing we're going to do, we have our Visual Studio Code open here, and we're going to create a web app using Vite. And you do need npm and Node.js installed. So we're using npm, and we're going to use Svelte. So we're just going to specify the template here in the command line to go ahead and set up to skip some command prompts. And we're calling it a DApp, but you can call it whatever you want. Cool. So now we have our DApp set up, so we can cd into the DApp and run npm install, and then run npm run dev to load the development environment. We can open that in a browser, and this is just kind of the default. So you can see we've got hello world, and we've got a little clicker. This is our default single page application, and that's what we're going to change today into our own little application. But if you got those two pieces together, good job. We now have a web application to start working with, and we need to set up some configuration, because when we deploy it to the Permaweb, we get a transaction ID for our app. And so when we use that to run our app, it'll be essentially a path on a gateway server. So it'd be arweave.net / some ID. And we want all of our assets, artifacts to essentially associate with that ID. So instead of associating to the root, like if we had, like site.css, instead of it associating to the root arweave.net, we want it to associate to the path arweave.net transaction ID slash site.css. And in order to do that, we need to tell our Vite configuration to set the base path in the define config essentially to an empty string. This will um, let our application know that anything we include in our public directory or wherever will basically generate an index HTML file with relative paths instead of root based paths for the slash. Um, if you're using Create React app, you would set like the homepage property in the package.json to like quotes with a dot for the current directory or relative directory. So it's kind of the same thing as that. And then the other piece is we want to be able to leverage the web with URLs and being able to have local URLs that we can copy and share with other people. And then when they click on them, it goes to that local um, local page or route. For example, an about page. With single page applications, if you do slash index, it's going to default to index.html. But if you do slash like about and your server isn't configured to reroute that route that doesn't exist on the server back to the index HTML page, it will 404 or basically say that that's not found. So what we need to do is come up with a way to handle that, and we don't have access to um, re re routing rules on the Arweave server since it's open and public and trustless and permissionless. Can't just change those rules. So we have to use what's called a hash-based router. And in our case, we're going to use a client-side router for Svelte called Tenro. And that's npm install -d for the development Tenro. And Tenro is a really cool project that basically gives us the ability to manage routes. Um, and we can enable a hash routing pattern. And I'll talk more about that when we get there. But basically, one of the things that you'll find if you want to support deep linked URLs is you will need a pattern. Hash routing is a good solution to this problem, but it may not be the solution for you. So, um, if you want to support deep link URLs, you need a way to do that. And what I've chosen is the hash router. So we've installed the hash router and we'll go into our app.svelte file under the source directory. And we'll go ahead and just restart our server so we have it up and running. And we're going to just get rid of all of this code and start from scratch. So we're going to do a script and we're going to import router and route from Tenro, like that. And we're going to create a counter. Let count equals 0. And we're going to change the router dot mode to hash by calling the hash function here. Okay, and make sure have our svelte extension installed. Okay. Won't take long. I don't know why it didn't default, but that's okay. There we go. Much better. Now, we're going to have two routes. We're going to have a home route and we're going to have an about route. So we do that with the route component and we give it a path attribute, and then anything we put in here will be our home route. We could include a component from a file, or we can just type in some components here. And then the same thing we're going to do is create an about route. So we'll say path equals / about, and we can just say about, and we can just create some links. Let's go home and create another link about. Okay. So that's our main app so far. Let's check it out and see what we've got. We've got home with an about link, and then we can see this hash router up at the top have the #, then /about. And that # is the hash, right? It includes the hash, so that really you're always requesting from the server point of view this HTML index page. And then the client side router can describe this about. So that way, if I copy this URL and paste it in a new window, I should load the about page and not a 404. So that's really the key there. So we can toggle back and forth. Pretty cool. So we've got our router set up, and now we're going to create an application. So we're going to create a Permaweb counter, and this counter is going to simply be a div with count, and our count variable will show there, which should be a 0, and then another div with a button, and this button will be on click calling a function that will basically increment the count, and we'll just call that inc, like so. So if we save that and we go to the home page, we have a pretty cool counter here. You can just click the button as many times as we want, and it's going to increment the count. All right. So we can also just quickly change the title to Permaweb counter. And then finally, we're going to just kind of change the about page, about Permaweb counter, like so. Cool. So that is our app. We have our router and our counter. We have an index page and an about page. And now we are ready to deploy to the Permaweb. So the first thing we need to do to deploy to the Permaweb is we can stop our development server, and we can install a CLI tool called ARKB. Oops. And we want to install that globally, so we'll use the -G flag. And that's going to install this CLI that will basically publish or upload all of our distribution files onto Arweave and create what's called a path manifest file. And this path manifest file basically contains all the routing rules for the Permaweb to determine when, index.html is requested, what, Arweave transaction ID data element is loaded, and so on and so forth. Um, Now we're going to be running on the production or the mainnet, but if you want, there's a tool called AR Local where you could run and test this locally. But for this workshop, we're going to just jump right in and run this on the mainnet, and we can build our production application by running npm run build, and that's going to build our files in this dist folder. You can see that we've got a few files in here, and they're all very small. So we've got index.html that's 0.34K, and then we've got our app, which is 13K, gzip 5K, which is pretty nice. So we've got that built, and we've installed our ARKB CLI, which there used to be an older deploy, but basically ARKB is Arweave deploy. It's a CLI that allows us to deploy to the Permaweb. And one of the reasons, one of the features we're going to use in that is this use bundler feature. And the use bundler feature will allow us to deploy our files basically with as minimum cost as possible. And if we didn't use the use bundler feature, no matter what size our file was, if it's below 256K, it would be charged the 256K price, because that's the minimum data transaction size you can put on Arweave. It's the minimum transaction size. And now that we have Bundler, since Bundler bundles a bunch of transactions together, we can mitigate that problem. And the nice thing about Bundler is that it's fast because it writes to the cache even before it's actually written to the blockchain, which is very, very nice. So it gives us speed, it gives us a low cost and a more efficient mechanism. So it actually helps Arweave process so many more transactions without getting congested. So we're a good Arweave citizen when we use Bundler to send our data, especially if it's small data. So now that we have the CLI installed, let's see if we can show the help. You can see it's got several commands and options here. And what we're going to do is use the deploy command, and we're going to say use bundler. And one thing that I always get tripped up, because the product is bundler without the E, but this flag is bundler with the E. So we're going to use bundler. So and here's an example right here. So arc deploy folder, use bundler, node 2 bundler network. That's exactly what we're going to do. So our folder is the dist folder. And we're just going to say use bundler, and we're going to use node 2 of the bundler network. The nice thing about node 2 is, for now, if your files are less than 100K, there's no cost. So we don't even have to add a wallet to this transaction. So the other thing we want to do, though, is tag our deployment so that we can reference it from a historical standpoint later, or a revision history kind of standpoint. So we're going to add tag name, deploy, and tag value. We'll call it T Wilson 63 counter, or your name, or handle dash counter, or whatever. And then we're going to add the auto confirm flag, but basically it's going to build everything and then say, yes, would you like to do this? And we're just going to skip that yes, so it'll do it all in one shot. And I think we've got it typed all in, so let's do it. Let's hit enter, and there it goes. It's calculated all the files, and you can see that it's deploying those. Um, and sweet, we have the items deployed. So before we go look at this, which it should be available in just like literally like 30 seconds, but before we go and look at it, we can go into the dist file and we should see this manifest ARKB file. This manifest ARKB file is that path manifest file, and you can see where index goes to path index.html, and then here's our paths, and all of our paths have the name of the path and the transaction ID. So index.html points to this transaction ID, and asset slash index blah 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 points to this one, etc. Cool. So we've got that, and now we should be able to visit this link. We'll copy that and we'll paste that in our window, our browser. And if everything works, we've got our counter. Pretty sweet. And it should function. We can click increment and it counts just like it did in the dev environment. Also, we should be able to go to about and we get our hash router route here that's relative to the ID. So we're on the about page and we can go home. So we can route very nicely between the two. And we can also copy this URL and share that, and it should route to that about page, which it does. Very cool. We have deployed a web application to the Permaweb. So if you were to grab this URL, you would see our wonderful Permaweb counter in all of its glory. But there's one other thing that's, now it's nice that this is on the Permaweb and it's there forever, but this is a really long URL to remember, and it may, kind of be difficult on the eyes for the traditional user. So it'd be nice to have a more fully qualified name URL. And that's the last part. We're going to set up a reverse proxy, and we're going to use dino.com. Now, you can set up reverse proxies with pretty much any technology. So we're going to use dino.com, which is an edge deployment technology. And if you go there and sign up, you'll get a project dashboard, and we're just going to say new project, and we're going to choose a playground. That way we don't have to, you know, open up a GitHub repository or anything like that. Let's see, I think we just hit play. There we go. And what we're going to do is um, add a proxy, and it's just a few lines of code in Dino. So we've got our serve, and we've got our serve handler. I'm just going to add this proxy handler here, like that. And then the last thing we want to do is add our service URL. And we'll add that between the import and the handler function. Um, Basically, what's happening is when a request comes into the server, we're going to fetch that with our Arweave.net ID. And then we're going to set some cache controls on it so that it will be cached, but then it will also be able to go stale. That way, if we're updating it multiple times, it doesn't, kind of get stuck in the edge cache um, for too long for a user. So what we need to do now is that we've got our proxy. We need to go back to our app and grab this URL here, copy that again, and we're going to paste that right here. Okay, so that's our proxy URL, and get rid of some of this white space. Cool. And we'll hit save and deploy, and it's generated a fully qualified domain off of dino.dev. So we're going to hit save and deploy. And we've got our Permaweb counter. And we can increment and go about home. So now with that, we have this reverse proxy that we can now just type this kind weasel 23 dino.dev in, and that should direct us or reverse proxy us to our Permaweb application. And I really enjoy this kind of process because it's super easy to update when I have updates. And then the other thing is that it's really easy to, if we go into that project and go into settings, it's easy to connect a domain. So if you've registered a domain like counter.app, you can go to add domain, enter it in, and follow the instructions, and it will automatically generate your SSL cert and map that domain over, just like I've done for Permanotes. So now I can do permanotes.app, and that basically runs through that node proxy onto Arweave. And then I've got, because I've tagged my Permanotes app, I've got this about page, and it's got all the deployment history. And each one of these I can click on and run. So if I click on that, I'm at Alpha 3 instead of Alpha 4, which is pretty cool. Even though my current version is Alpha 4. So all of these apps will work as good as they worked when they were first deployed. So that's kind of the summary of how to, kind of create a web app and configure it to work for the Permaweb, then publish it on the Permaweb using the RKB CLI, and then finally setting up a reverse proxy so you can use a nice URL qualified name to link to your application. And hopefully you find this helpful. And thanks again. Have a good day.